It's the week beginning Monday the 27th of August, and this is Business Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In each episode of this bonus series, we speak to an industry expert about a big business story that'll shape how we live our lives in the years to come. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the business week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Arian McNichol, and alongside him, our special guest, Kevin Poulter, employment law partner at Freeths LLP. Kevin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Welcome to me.
Alongside your day job, you've got your own podcast series called The Hearing.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's a podcast where I go and speak to, hopefully, and usually, so far so good, interesting people who are somehow related to the law. So not necessarily lawyers, but we've had politicians. We have people, we've had Dean Strang, who you might know from Making a Murderer. So people that have got some sort of interest and have got a story to tell. And so far, it's fascinating. And actually, in some ways, that's led me to talk about what we're talking about today.
And what have you brought with you today?
Well, we're talking about whether disability is the next big opportunity.
1 billion people around the world live with some form of disability. The vast majority are in developing countries, and for too long, many have been denied their rights or prevented from fulfilling their potential. Children are barred from going to school. Adults are unable to live independently, are excluded from the workplace, or prevented from voting. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds are forced every day to deal with prejudice and even violence. As a result, they are missing out on the opportunities many of us take for granted. And we are all missing out on the contribution they could make.
That was British Prime Minister Theresa May speaking at the end of July at the first ever Global Disability Summit hosted here in London. Kevin, why, in your opinion, was this event so important?
Well, like you say, it's the first event of its type, and it was really to address the huge problem that's facing incredibly 1 billion disabled people internationally. Apparently 80% of those people are in developing or underdeveloped countries, but that leaves a lot of people on the sides, and they are not being given the access to jobs, to education that other people have been, and it's time something changed. And actually, whether now the time is ripe, and more through need than choice.
And this wasn't an event that I saw covered anywhere.
Well, this is what's so surprising. I had to dig to find the story. It's just been incredibly underpublicised. It's been in none of the press, but it's come out of it has some incredible comments, some commitments made by not only governments but also by independent organisations, charities, to show support for disabled people worldwide.
And tell us about those incentives from the UK government. So if you run a business, there is an incentive now, an extra incentive to employ disabled people.
Well, really, there should be an incentive to employ a disabled person, full stop. There shouldn't need to be one, but there is, and sometimes there is an expense to it or a cost. And these things have been around for a while. It's just, again, like the summit itself, they're massively underpublicised. The government doesn't seem to make a great deal about them, to identify them to businesses or to individuals themselves. And I think that this is an opportunity to really redress that, for the government to put some money where its mouth is, but also to put some support out there. The Conservative government incredibly committed to getting 1 million more disabled people into employment by 2027. Now, as far as I'm seeing it, and being on the coalface as an employment lawyer, I don't see that's happening.
No, and the amount of money, so what is it? What's the incentive? Because it doesn't seem to me like a staggering amount of money, to be quite honest.
Well, this is what you're talking about is a very limited set of circumstances. It's really to support what we call supported employers. So the figure is £5,000, but it's only available to a very small number of employers, those who already employ 50% of disabled staff. So that's one thing. That's an extra incentive. Yes, there's also been a commitment towards people with arthritis or skeletal problems, to encourage them into the workplace, to support them in the workplace, and to put research behind that. But is it too little too late? And really, does the burden fall to businesses who maybe want to improve conditions, want to bring people into work, but they just don't have the cash if they're a small business or the awareness to do that.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, Arian? For the Conservatives, disabled people in the workplace might be, a very well-intentioned goal, but it's a goal that they would like to be achieved by businesses doing the right thing independently. And of course, the reality is they don't. So now they've got state intervention. They close down the Remploy factories that used to employ exclusively disabled workers, and now it seems to me have realised that money has to change hands.
Yeah, I mean, it does have to be a change that happens at both ends. Both you need to be ensuring that employers are doing their bit and making sure that they're putting people with disabilities at the forefront of their minds when they're considering who to employ. And you also need to ensure that people are getting the right training. And I think that was the big shift that went on with Remploy, that it was started in the 40s, and it was originally an opportunity for people to get back into work in a really sort of manual way. Originally Remploy set up these factories around the country, and disabled people worked in those factories. And then around the sort of turn of the millennium, there was a reappraisal of that, and people and the prevailing view was that actually you need to give people with disabilities the sorts of skills that will get them into ordinary employment, not just working in factories.
What is the legal situation, Kevin, in terms of what employers legally have to provide? Because it's now the case, as we know, that you have to offer a job to the best qualified person.
That's right.
Supposedly regardless of ethnicity, sexuality, whatever, and that includes disability. And yet the reality is, here we are actually broadcasting from an office that has 6 floors. I'm sure Dennis Publishing, which runs The Week, have disabled members of staff. And yet actually when the lift breaks, I don't know how you get to the 5th floor. It is a problem, isn't it? Not every building in London and in the UK is adapted.
That's right. But it's not just about accessibility, physical accessibility. We're talking about how the website works. Is it suitable for a visually impaired person? Is there support available? Everyone's working from home now, or more and more people are working from home. I read this week that only, I think, 6% of people now in work 9 to 5. There are different ways of working, flexibility, agile working, and there's more and more opportunity. And even if there is a problem with physical accessibility, we can work around it. And I think that's what's changing. But in terms of what a business has to do, well, you're right. It has to treat people fairly and equally. And in very few circumstances can you take positive action. We don't call it positive discrimination, but to take steps to improve the opportunities or the chances for those with a protected characteristic to step up. And what we're seeing is fewer and fewer people from the disabled community in senior positions, certainly going through promotions, but also about getting those jobs to start with. So it's not just about in employment, it's about those who are coming through recruitment. And that's what's difficult. And the government has tried, and there's the Disability Confident sort of campaign, which is trying to encourage businesses to support and encourage applications from disabled workers by doing certain things, by improving their chances for an interview, perhaps even how you read a CV or fill out an application form. Those things are changing, but they're so few and far between that we're not seeing the big shift that certainly the government's saying it wants to see. How do we get there?
And you just used the phrase the disabled community, but disabilities, obviously there's so many that get lumped together in that term, and each individual is different and has a different case history. There are some people with physical disabilities that have mental disabilities too, and there are others who don't, for example. There are people with mental health conditions that get considered a disability. So having a catch-all rule seems weird when it's a case-by-case basis, isn't it?
It is. Let me just tell you what the Equality Act definition of a disabled person is. So it's somebody who has a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on their ability to do normal day-to-day activities. Now, that's quite broad-ranging. There are certain exceptions, or people that are caught automatically, cancer, for example, HIV, blindness, who don't have to follow those rules or meet those qualifications. But that's quite broad-ranging in some ways, but also very narrowing. And what's confusing is what we think of as disabled people might not automatically meet that criteria. So, I don't know if you've seen recently, the Blue Badge scheme is about to be extended to those people with, in speech marks, hidden disabilities. Autism, for example, people with mental health issues who can't travel by public transport. Now, some of those wouldn't be necessarily caught by that definition. Because it doesn't necessarily affect their, say, day-to-day activities or have sometimes a long-term effect either. So Whether we have a standard definition of disabled is difficult to say, and even talk about changing the international symbol for disability, somebody in a wheelchair, because it's not just what we see anymore, it's about what's hidden behind their clothes.
And I think that's the thing as well, that your standard business, when they start to think about getting more disabled people to work for them, they think about those simple things like access to the building.
It is.
And you're exactly right, Ollie. We have disabled loos on every floor, but if the lift goes down, there's really no way to get someone who's from the ground floor up to where we are, say, right now on the 5th floor. But even so, it goes much deeper than that. And the changes that organisations need to be making don't start and end with putting ramps outside your building. And I think that that's the thing that probably isn't changing as fast as we need to see it changing.
That's right. There's a mental shift. And as I mentioned at the start, one of the people I interviewed as part of the podcast was somebody who had been in work as a lawyer and who overnight suddenly lost use of her legs. And she had a year to try and recover, didn't work, but eventually came back to the workplace. And she's not alone. 85% of disabled people aren't born with that disability. They acquire it over their lifetime. And sometimes that's easier because you know the person already, you know their abilities and capabilities, certainly mentally in this case, but the physical ability is taken away. And yet she was known, but still treated with a certain amount of contempt on her return. Such comments being made as well, if we employed everybody like you, would not have a business. Now, this is only 10 years ago or so. It's not a long time ago. And the mind shift has to change between what is considered a possibility, what is a capability, and what actually is a detriment. And that's the real concern. We've got to think no longer about the ramps and the lifts. We need to think about how we can make that person's life better. We can bring them back into the workplace or encourage them into the workplace to start with, whilst also being sensitive to their needs and also asking them how we can help without being, I suppose, patronising. And it is subjective. You're right. Everybody is different. Everybody treats people in a different way, but wants to be treated in a different way. Very difficult to do, and I say sensitive.
And the truth is that if someone's in a lot of pain because of a physical impairment, they might not be able to make it through a long working day. So it's all very well saying everyone's equal, but actually they might not be able to fulfill the same job that they had before. That's a change for employers as well, isn't it?
Exactly right. And there was the case of James Ross, who worked for Brewdog, the large Scottish brewer, and he got a condition called Stargardt disease, which sends you gradually blind. And he requested that Brewdog make a few changes to be able to keep him in employment. And external assessors found that really they only needed to make minor changes for him to be able to keep his job pretty much the way that it was. But Brewdog dismissed him, and he won a wrongful dismissal action against Brewdog. But it's really, it is one of those cases where people have a condition that comes on later, and it's not going to necessarily inhibit every part of their work, but the employer just needs to change things slightly and they'll be able to keep doing their job.
And understand that that's part of their responsibility. I mean, is that the kind of case that you deal with at Freeth, Kevin?
To a certain extent, yeah. And reality is that disability discrimination cases are actually few and far between, probably because there aren't that many disabled workers out there, or some of those that are there are treated fairly. But one of the big problems that employers come to me with is about, well, what's a reasonable adjustment? And that's talking about if they're in pain and they can't work through the day, what can we do to support them? Well, it might be that you can support them from working from home. Oh, well, we don't have those sorts of facilities available. Well, you can get them. And actually, it's not just helping that person, it's helping everybody who, whether they're waiting for the plumber for the day, they can also do some work. They don't have to take a day's holiday. It suits a lot of people. But really, until the pressure is put onto employers to take such actions. And yes, incredibly, the law's only been around since 1995, the Disability Discrimination Act, now under the Equality Act. It's not that long ago. People are still learning, finding their feet, but there has to be some pressure to put onto businesses by the government, by Parliament, to really force this change, like we're seeing across other diversity areas. And
also, presumably, education made to highlight the advantages of having disabled people work in your workplace, because there are advantages, and so it doesn't have to be just stick. It can also be carrot. You can
right.
show the incentives as well as try to educate that way.
There are plenty of statistics out there saying how beneficial a diverse workplace is, and how it's useful to have people from different backgrounds, of course. But as I've said, until we see some positive action from government we have to force change sometimes. I think this is one of those examples. One of the things forcing that change might, of course, be the aging workforce. The fact that more of us might be disabled in our working lifetimes, in fact. But also Brexit. We're losing a huge part of the labour market, potentially. Now, we've got a waiting resource here who, like you say, are just not there yet and haven't been given those opportunities. Maybe we'll be forced into doing that.
Okay, so not as much has changed since 1995 as perhaps the people who drafted that initial Equality Act might have liked. Where do you think we'll be in another 20 years' time? I'm looking for some optimism here.
Well, I think that we're looking at a time when change will have to come because it will be necessary. People at the senior levels, we've now got one head of state, I think it's Ecuador, who's a disabled person. Now, we need to see more people in those senior positions. The same arguments that we've seen from women, that we need to get people in those senior positions, that is, I hesitate to use the word, but it's normalised that people with disabilities are out there. There are role models out there for people to aspire to, and we see more and more support at the grassroots level, but also more optimism from people in schools, coming through the junior ranks and saying, well, look, I can achieve this and I just need a little bit of help, a little bit of support. And all you have to do as an employer is just to take that one small step and say, what can we do to help?
Okay, Kevin, thank you. That was your business briefing for this week. My thanks to Kevin Poulton and to Arian McNichol. For more on our series on good news for British business, sponsored by Barclays Corporate Banking, go to theweek.co.uk/good news, or you can see this week's magazine. And to subscribe to hear our main podcast, The Week Unwrapped, just head to theweekunwrapped.com and follow the links there. I've been Ollie Mann. The music is by Tom Morby, our producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until next time, bye-bye.